A poor boy named Sahir once defended a lonely girl, Amira, teaching her to stand tall when the world tried to crush her. Years later, when life leaves Sahir broken and on the brink, a sleek black Rolls-Royce pulls up, and out steps Amira, successful, powerful, and back to repay a promise. But can the kindness of the past save a life in the present? And will Sahir allow himself to be saved? Or is his pride too heavy a burden to let go? It was the kind of neighborhood where hope seemed to drip away, like rainwater through cracked rooftops. The buildings were bruised and tired, their paint peeling under years of neglect. Rusted pipes groaned behind the walls, and children's laughter rarely reached the air, replaced instead by barking dogs or shouting voices. A dusted wind swept through narrow alleys, where old newspapers danced like forgotten dreams. The boy, Sahir, was used to walking with his head down, dodging puddles in his worn-out sneakers with the holes at the toes. His clothes, faded to muted grays, clung thinly to his small frame, unable to fight off the creeping cold. Yet, there was something about his eyes, dark and bright, like sparks that refused to be extinguished, that set him apart from the other kids on the street. The youngest of 4 siblings, he had no time to dream. Work began as soon as school let out, hauling crates of fruit for Mr. Moreno at the corner market. Coins clinked in his hand at the end of the day, far too few to matter. That's when he saw her, Amira. It was a dull afternoon when the new girl appeared on the cracked pavement. Amira's long braids hung low over her shoulders, her dress clean but far too fine for a neighborhood like this. She stood there awkwardly, shifting from one foot to the other like a bird unsure where to land. Sahir noticed her before the others did. Not that the boys ever needed much of an excuse. "Look at the princess!" yelled Omar, a boy 2 years older and twice as mean. "What's she doing here? Got lost from her castle?" Omar's pack of friends cackled as they circled her like hungry dogs, their taunts cutting sharp through the air. Amira's chin lifted slightly, but her trembling fingers gripped the straps of her bag. "Leave me alone," she whispered. Her words, soft and broken, hit Sahir like a blow. He knew that voice, the sound of someone trying to make themselves small enough to disappear. "Hey!" Sahir shouted, marching up to Omar and shoving him back, hard enough to shock. "Go pick on someone your own size." The laughter faltered, Omar's face scrunched with irritation. "What's it to you, Sahir? Want to fight?" "She's just standing there," Sahir retorted, hands balled into fists. "You've got nothing better to do?" Omar took a step forward, but Sahir didn't flinch. For a moment, they stared each other down, 2 boys who'd fought their way through scraped knees and hungry nights, but then Omar spat at the ground. "Not worth it," he muttered, waving his pack away. They disappeared, their laughter lingering like an echo. Amira looked up at Sahir, her wide eyes glassy with unshed tears. "You didn't have to." "Yeah, well, someone had to," he shrugged. "You knew here?" She nodded. "My father, we had to move here for work." "Welcome to nowhere, I guess," Sahir said, pulling his hands into his pockets. "I'm Sahir. What's your name?" "Amira." The way she said it, soft and uncertain, stuck with him. For days after, Sahir found himself noticing Amira everywhere. She sat alone at recess, eating bread that was too fine for the other kids to ignore. They whispered as she passed, calling her stuck-up or spoiled, even though Sahir saw nothing of the sort. He watched how she lingered at the edges of playgrounds, drawing circles in the dirt with her shoes. One day after school, he spotted her in the lot beside Mr. Moreno's store. She sat on a concrete step, her bag next to her, staring at nothing. "Hey," Sahir said as he walked up. "What are you doing here?" Amira didn't answer. Instead, she looked up and for the first time, Sahir noticed how lonely she seemed, lonelier than him even. "Why don't you sit with anyone at school?" he asked. "They don't like me." "Then stop caring," he replied with a shrug. "Who needs them? You're just as good as anyone else." She blinked at him, as though the thought had never crossed her mind. "You think so?" "Yeah," he grinned. "But you gotta show them." "Show them what?" "That you don't need their permission to matter. If you walk like you've got somewhere to be, they'll think you do. My big brother always says that." Amira smiled faintly. It was small and hesitant, like a crack of sunlight through clouds. "Thanks, Sahir." And so it began. They didn't say much at first. Sahir would find her after school and walk her partway home. Sometimes they'd sit on the concrete step, talking about nothing, how the sky looked like spilled milk that day, or how Sahir dreamed of becoming someone important, like a mechanic or a pilot. "You could be anything," Amira would say, her voice full of belief. "Nah," Sahir would reply, shaking his head. "I'm just the boy with empty pockets. Not much chance for a kid like me." "Well, someday I'll be rich," Amira said, her voice suddenly fierce. "And I'll come back. I'll help you the way you helped me." Sahir laughed. "Sure, princess. I'll be waiting right here." He never imagined she'd mean it. That winter was colder than most. Frost crept over windows, and the wind carried a bitter bite. Sahir's family burned cardboard in the metal drum out back, and dinners shrank from rice and lentils to just rice. Sahir kept showing up, though, dragging crates for Mr. Moreno, brushing the ice from his face, his knuckles cracked and raw. Amira sometimes sat beside him with a thermos of tea, her hands wrapped in mittens that were always far too warm. "You'll freeze," she'd tell him. "I'm fine," he'd reply, shoving his hands deeper into his jacket sleeves. And maybe he was, because for the first time in his life, someone was looking at him like he mattered. The years rolled on like worn tires over gravel, grinding slowly but never stopping. Sahir and Amira grew, their quiet friendship solidified like a whispered secret no one else could touch. She brought warmth when the cold seemed endless, and he gave her courage when the world tried to make her invisible. But life always has a way of pulling things apart. By the time they were both 12, Amira's father found a better job in another city. She told Sahir on a rainy afternoon, sitting on their usual concrete step, the rainwater streaming like tears down the cracked sidewalk. "We're moving." Her voice was steady, but her hands shook as they fiddled with the edges of her notebook. Sahir stopped mid-sip from the cracked plastic cup of tea she'd handed him earlier. "When?" he asked, though the word tasted bitter. "2 days." Sahir looked down at his worn shoes, where rain pooled in the holes near his toes. 2 days. Just like that, everything they'd built, a year of shared stories, jokes, and promises, would scatter into the wind. He tried to think of something to say, something to stop it, but words never came easy to him. Instead, Amira reached into her bag and pulled out a small blue notebook with frayed edges. She pressed it into his hands. "I want you to have this. I write in it when I feel small, when I think I don't matter." Sahir ran his fingers over the cover. "You don't need to give me anything." "Yes, I do," she insisted, "because I'll never forget what you said to me that day. You remember? You don't need their permission to matter." He nodded. He remembered. "I want you to write in here," she said softly, her eyes glistening. "Write all the things you want to be, everything you dream of. And don't stop, Sahir. One day I'm coming back, I swear it." "People don't come back here," he replied, unable to hide the edge in his voice. "I will." Her conviction silenced him. For a moment, they just sat there as the rain pattered around them, both holding on to a promise neither fully understood. 2 days later, Amira was gone. Years passed, and Sahir's world grew heavier. By the time he was 16, school had become a luxury he couldn't afford. His father's cough turned into something worse, something that emptied their pockets faster than they could fill them. Sahir worked 3 jobs, lifting crates at the market, cleaning at the textile factory overnight, and sweeping floors in a garage. He told himself he didn't mind, that this was life. Some people walked, others crawled. He just happened to be crawling. But on nights when the world felt too big, Sahir would take out Amira's notebook, now stained and dog-eared, and flip through the empty pages. He never wrote in it. Not because he didn't have dreams, but because dreams seemed too far out of reach to touch. Then his father died. The loss hit their small home like a fist. His older brothers left one by one, some for jobs, others simply to escape the burden. His mother, frail and exhausted, stared at the empty chair where his father used to sit, her face a portrait of grief carved into stone. Sahir stayed because someone had to. For 3 years, the weight of survival crushed him. He stopped thinking about tomorrow because tomorrow only promised more of the same. At night, he lay on a thin mattress on the floor, staring at the cracked ceiling. Sometimes he'd whisper into the darkness, "You were right, Amira. People don't come back." And yet, a tiny voice in him, one that sounded like her, would whisper back, "Wait." By the time Sahir was 19, he was gaunt and thin, his face older than his years. He worked only at the garage now, his hands perpetually stained with grease, his back aching from hours bent over engines. The owner, Mr. Ibrahim, liked him well enough, but kindness didn't pay much. One evening, as Sahir sat outside the garage after closing, a sharp cough shook his chest. He doubled over, the sound scraping out of him like rusted nails. His co-workers had noticed it for weeks, but no one said anything. In this neighborhood, sickness was just a quieter kind of death, one that people watched from a distance. He pressed a rag to his mouth and looked at it. Red, blood. The cold settled deep in his chest, and for the first time, Sahir felt afraid. A week later, the coughing turned relentless. He couldn't work anymore, and his small savings evaporated into medical bills. He sat in his dim room one evening, the air stale and heavy. His mother, now frailer than ever, knocked softly and entered with a bowl of thin soup. "Eat, beta." He shook his head, pushing it away. "I'm not hungry." She lingered for a moment before leaving him alone. Sahir looked at the small blue notebook on the floor beside his mattress. He picked it up, flipping through its still empty pages. "Dreams," he muttered, a humorless smile curving his lips. Just then, a deep rumbling sound echoed from outside, a sound too foreign for his street. Sahir froze. Engines didn't sound like that in this part of the city. His mother's voice called from the front of the house. "Sahir, come!" Slowly, he rose and shuffled to the doorway, the ache in his chest weighing him down. Outside, parked in front of their crumbling gate, was a sleek black Rolls-Royce. The car gleamed under the pale streetlights, its windows tinted, its presence as out of place as a diamond on a beggar's hand. From the back seat, the door opened, and out stepped Amira. Sahir blinked, convinced for a moment that he was hallucinating. She looked different, older, taller, but the same fire still lived in her dark eyes. Her coat was deep blue, her hair cascading in perfect braids, and she walked with a confidence that seemed to push the world back from her path. "Sahir?" Her voice trembled with disbelief, as if she'd spoken his name 1,000 times but never thought she'd say it here. He stared at her, his throat tightening. "Amira?" For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Amira took a step closer, her expression shattering into something raw. "You waited." Sahir stood frozen, as if the world had suddenly paused and left only the sound of the car's idling engine and the distant clatter of his neighbors peeking from behind curtains. He looked at Amira, this polished, confident woman stepping out of a car so foreign to their cracked streets, and he felt small, smaller than he'd ever felt before. "Amira?" he repeated softly, like her name might crumble if he spoke it too loudly. She smiled faintly, though there was something desperate behind it, an urgency he couldn't yet place. "You look exactly the same. Wish I could say the same for you," Sahir said, his voice rough from disbelief and sickness. His cracked hands gripped the doorway to steady himself, the heat of embarrassment prickling his skin. He looked down at his stained clothes, the grease under his nails, and the sunken shadows under his eyes. Her world didn't belong here. He didn't belong with her. Amira took a step closer, her heels tapping against the uneven pavement. "I've been looking for you, Sahir." "For what?" he asked sharply, his words unintentionally bitter. "To remind me I still don't matter?" Her face fell. "Don't say that. You—" Sahir turned away, retreating into the shadows of the house. He didn't want her to see his shame, the holes in the walls, the dishes piled in the sink, the thin mattress he slept on. "Go home, Amira," he muttered, his voice hollow. "This isn't a place for someone like you." "Sahir!" she called, her voice slicing through the evening air like a plea. He stopped, but didn't turn. "People like you don't come back here. I told you that. I promised you," Amira said firmly, taking another step forward. "And you're wrong. I did come back. I came back for you." An hour later, they sat in the dim living room, the flickering bulb overhead doing little to brighten the space. Amira had insisted on coming inside, her determined stare leaving no room for argument. Now she sat across from Sahir, who fidgeted with the edge of his sleeve, his lungs rattling softly every time he breathed. The silence sat heavy between them until Amira finally spoke. "I want to help you," she said, her voice clear but soft. Sahir scoffed, though the sound turned into a cough that sent him doubling over. Amira leaned forward instinctively, but he held up a hand waving her off. "You can't fix this, Amira," he said once the coughing subsided. "You can't buy back years. You can't buy health. Let me try," she interrupted, her voice wavering as she fought to stay calm. "You're sick, Sahir, and I have the money to get you help." He stared at her, disbelief warring with anger. "Help?" "Yes." She leaned forward, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Hospitals, doctors, whatever you need. I'll pay for it all." Sahir shook his head. "Why?" Amira's eyes softened. "Because you saved me." His chest tightened. "That was years ago. It doesn't matter," she insisted. "You were the only person who saw me. You made me believe I was worth something when I felt invisible, Sahir. And now I have the chance to do the same for you." Her voice broke slightly and she swallowed hard to steady herself. "Do you think I forgot what you told me? That I didn't need anyone's permission to matter? I carry those words with me every single day. In every meeting, every decision, every moment where I doubted myself. You gave me that." Sahir dropped his gaze to the floor, his throat aching from more than sickness. "You don't owe me anything, Amira. I'm not here because I owe you," she said firmly. "I'm here because you're my friend, and because you need someone to believe in you the way you once believed in me." Sahir clenched his fists, feeling anger and shame twist together in his gut. "I'm not your charity case. I know you're not," she replied softly. "You're Sahir, the boy who fought for me when no one else did." The days that followed passed in a blur. Amira stayed. At first, Sahir resisted. He refused to let her pay for doctors, refused to let her fix what felt so permanently broken. But Amira was relentless, her fire impossible to extinguish. She spoke to his mother quietly in the kitchen, gently convincing her to let her help. She cleaned dishes without asking, warmed tea when Sahir's cough grew unbearable, and never once looked at the house, at him, with pity. Instead, she treated him like he was still the boy who had shoved Omar back, the boy who had given her courage when she had none of her own. Slowly, Sahir's defenses began to crack. One evening, he finally agreed to see a doctor Amira had arranged. The clinic was far from their neighborhood, with pristine white walls that made Sahir feel small and out of place. But Amira walked beside him, her presence steady and unshakable. The diagnosis was harsh: tuberculosis, worsened by years of untreated illness. The doctor spoke of treatments, recovery time, and medication, all of it sounding distant and foreign to Sahir. "Do you want to get better, Sahir?" Amira asked softly as they left the clinic. Sahir hesitated. Then he looked at her, the girl who had once been so small and fragile, and he saw something in her eyes that made him say, yes. Amira moved mountains for him. She arranged treatments, paid for medications, and found a specialist who assured them recovery was possible. She showed up every day, sometimes with bags of food, other times just with quiet conversation. Sahir didn't understand her persistence, her willingness to fight for someone like him, but he no longer had the strength to push her away. As the weeks passed, his body began to heal, bit by bit. The coughing lessened, color returned to his cheeks. He could stand a little longer, breathe a little easier. One evening, as they sat in the small living room, Sahir turned to Amira and said quietly, "Why me?" Amira smiled softly, reaching into her bag. From it, she pulled out something small and familiar, a notebook, its cover frayed and stained. "Because," she said, holding it up, "you're the one who taught me how to dream." Sahir stared at the notebook, the very same one she'd given him years ago. For the first time, he felt the weight of his life lifting piece by piece. "You kept it," he whispered. "Of course I did," Amira replied, her voice gentle. "And now, Sahir, I want you to write in it. This time, write all the things you're going to be." Months passed, and with them, the cold grip of illness loosened its hold on Sahir. The change was slow but undeniable, like the first fragile bloom pushing through cracked soil. He grew stronger, his frame filling out, the deep rattle in his chest replaced by breaths that came easier. For the first time in years, Sahir began to look less like a shadow of himself. Amira stayed throughout it all. True to her word, she never let him feel like a burden. She treated him as an equal, as someone worth saving, not out of pity, but out of respect for the boy who had once given her the gift of courage when she'd had none. One quiet evening, as the sun dipped low and spilled its amber glow through the grimy window of Sahir's small home, Amira sat at the table with his mother. Sahir leaned in the doorway, listening to their soft laughter. It was a sound that had been missing from the house for years. His mother, her face no longer so hollow, seemed years younger in that moment, grateful and proud. "You've given us so much," his mother said, her voice trembling as she reached across the table to hold Amira's hand. "I don't know how we'll ever repay you. You don't have to," Amira replied softly, her gaze flicking to Sahir. "He's already given me more than he'll ever know." Sahir turned away, the weight of those words pressing into his chest. Weeks later, Sahir stood outside the garage where he used to work, his hands thrust deep into the pockets of his freshly cleaned jacket. The owner, Mr. Ibrahim, stared at him in surprise. "You look like a new man, Sahir," Mr. Ibrahim said, clapping a grease-stained hand on his shoulder. "What brings you here?" Sahir shifted nervously. "I need a job." Mr. Ibrahim frowned. "You don't need to do that, boy. I heard about your friend. She'll take care of you." Sahir's jaw tightened. "That's not who I am." Mr. Ibrahim studied him for a long moment before finally nodding. "You're still the hardest worker I've ever known. The job's yours, but I've got better things for you than sweeping floors. Come Monday, you'll be learning how to fix the engines proper. That's a trade worth knowing." "Thank you," Sahir said quietly, his heart swelling with something he hadn't felt in years, pride. That weekend, Sahir met Amira at their usual spot, the concrete step outside Mr. Moreno's old market, now long abandoned. It felt smaller than he remembered, the paint more chipped, but the memories were still there, alive and bright. Amira sat waiting for him, her long coat tucked neatly around her, her eyes lighting up when she saw him. "You look good," she said with a grin. "Healthy." Sahir chuckled as he sat beside her, dropping a small notebook into her lap. "What's this?" she asked. "Open it." Amira flipped open the cover. Inside, page after page was filled with neat handwriting. Lists of things Sahir dreamed of becoming, things he wanted to learn, things he hoped for. Mechanic, pilot, business owner, helper, a man who matters. Amira's fingers trembled as she flipped through the pages, her expression softening. "You wrote them." Sahir smiled. "You were right. I just needed to believe I could be more than this." Amira closed the notebook gently, holding it against her chest. "I told you I'd come back for you." "You did," Sahir replied, his voice steady but filled with gratitude. "You kept your promise." For a moment, neither of them said anything. The world around them felt quiet, like it was holding its breath just for them. Then Amira turned to him, her gaze sharp with something he hadn't seen before. "I know you're working again," she said, "but I want to do more for you, Sahir." He shook his head immediately. "Amira, I can't." "Listen to me." Her voice was soft but firm. "You helped me when no one else would. You changed my life, and now I want to help you change yours." Sahir frowned, unsure. "What do you mean?" Amira smiled, reaching into her bag and pulling out a small envelope. She handed it to him, her fingers lingering for just a second before letting go. "It's a start. Use it however you want. To learn, to build, to grow. No strings attached." Sahir stared at the envelope, his hands shaking as he held it. He didn't need to open it to know what was inside. "Why?" he asked again, his voice breaking. "Why are you doing this for me?" Amira's smile was soft, almost wistful. "Because you believed in me before I believed in myself. You saved me when I needed it most. And now it's my turn to save you." Sahir looked up at her, his chest tight, his throat aching with words he couldn't say. Finally, he nodded, slipping the envelope into his pocket. "I'll make you proud, Amira," he said quietly. "You already have." Years later, a familiar black Rolls-Royce pulled into a quiet driveway outside a bustling garage. The name, Sahir's Motors, gleamed on a polished sign above the entrance. The smell of oil and steel lingered in the air as men worked on cars, their laughter and shouts filling the space. Inside, Sahir stood by a counter, now a man of 25. He wore a clean blue uniform with his name stitched neatly over the pocket, his hands stained with grease but steady and sure. The boy who had once stared hopelessly at cracked ceilings was gone, replaced by someone strong, someone whole. The bell above the door jingled, and Sahir looked up. Amira stepped inside, her smile bright and warm. "You did it," she said, looking around the garage with pride. "You really did it." Sahir smiled back. "I had good reason to." She laughed softly, the sound echoing through the space like sunlight. "I told you you'd matter someday." "You told me," Sahir replied, his voice steady and full of quiet gratitude. "But I had to believe it too." Amira nodded, tears shimmering in her eyes. Sometimes, the kindness we give returns to us like an echo, faint at first, but louder when we need it most. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to HeroKind Stories for more heartwarming tales of courage, connection, and triumph. Leave a comment below. What did you think of Sahir's journey? Has someone's kindness ever come back to change your life? We'd love to hear your story.